I have to choose between my two kids, but only one is actually mine. I took in a foster kid for a quick paycheck. I know how that sounds, but hear me out. Theo was 17 and had been returned by 14 families. I was broke and needed money to pay for my wife's early Alzheimer's. Our bio son Jaden had been in prison for statutory rape, so it's not like we had other responsibilities. Theo moved in on a Thursday afternoon with one garbage bag of belongings and eyes that dared me to reject him. I showed him Jaden's old room, rattling off the rules like terms of a lease. He nodded once and disappeared behind the door. For weeks, we were just strangers sharing walls. He'd leave before my 5:30 a.m. alarm, and I'd come home at 9 p.m. to find him already locked away, only the thin line of light under his door proving he existed. One afternoon, I heard the Arctic Monkeys blasting through his headphones while I made coffee. I told him it was my favorite band, and we played the music from Alexa instead. When I went grocery shopping, I picked up his favorite Celsius flavor without being asked. We developed a perfect rhythm without needing to talk. By month 3, he knew me better than most of my coworkers. He'd replace my coffee pods before it ran out, so I'd make extra portions of dinner for when he felt like snacking. Almost like a real family if you squinted. Then I got the call. "You need to come get your wife. She's crazy." I found Rose 2 blocks away in her thin nightgown, bare feet bleeding on the concrete. When I tried to wrap my jacket around her, she clawed at my face. "Don't touch me! Where's my son? What did you do with my son?" My heart shattered. The EMTs arrived and tried to grab her arms, but she fought harder, animal sounds coming from her throat I'd never heard before. That's when Theo appeared from the darkness, still in yesterday's clothes like he'd been awake all night. He started humming something I didn't recognize, low and steady like a heartbeat. Rose's whole body changed. The wild fear drained from her face as she turned toward the sound. "My baby," she whispered, reaching out with shaking hands. "You came back to me." Theo kept humming while walking closer, palms out where she could see them, moving like water. "It's okay, Mrs. K," he said in this soft voice I'd never heard, like he'd done this before. "Want to go home? I'll make you tea." She grabbed his hand like a lifeline. The EMTs let him ride in the ambulance. He sat next to her gurney, thumb tracing circles on her palm, humming whenever her breathing quickened. By the time we hit the ER, she was calm enough they skipped the restraints. The doctor pulled me aside near the vending machines, his voice low. If that kid hadn't calmed her down, we would have been forced to put her in involuntary hold. I turned to look at Theo, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he pulled out the spiral notebook I'd always seen him carrying. As he flipped through, my heart throbbed. Each page was filled with documentation on my wife's progress. All those mornings I'd found her peaceful in bed, thinking the new meds were working. It was him. We brought Rose home as the sun came up. I went to make coffee, hands still shaking, and noticed the kitchen trash overflowing. I pulled the bag out and envelopes spilled everywhere. MIT, Stanford, Berkeley. All college acceptances, all dated exactly 3 months ago, right when her night terrors started. "They were too far from here," was all he said when I asked. That's when I knew. This kid wasn't placement anymore. He was family. A week later, my phone rang. Jaden was getting released early from prison. "Good behavior," they said. My stomach dropped. After being caught mingling with a 13-year-old at age 19, Jaden wasn't allowed to live in a home with anyone under 18. Even after Theo's 18th birthday, our house would be listed as an established residence of a minor for 6 months. He would be homeless that entire time, unless Theo left. Jaden called that same day, voice cracking like he was 14 again. "Dad, I did everything they asked. I just want to come home." I thought I had kept it a secret from Theo until I found him packing up, folding his few clothes into that same garbage bag. "I know how this goes," he said without looking at me. "Real family comes first. Thank you for letting me pretend." Rose woke up that morning asking for the one who reads to me. She hadn't mentioned Jaden's name in 2 years. I knew I had a decision to make. One that would not only affect my life, but Rose and Jaden's too. I stood frozen in the doorway watching Theo fold his worn t-shirts into that same garbage bag he'd brought 6 months ago. His hands moved steady and practiced like he'd done this 100 times before. Rose's voice drifted from our bedroom down the hall, asking for the one who reads to her. My phone buzzed against my leg with another text from Jaden about when he could come home. Theo placed each piece of clothing into the bag without looking up at me. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, making dust particles float between us. I walked into the room and sat down hard on the edge of his bed. The mattress creaked under my weight. "Stop packing," I said. He kept folding a pair of jeans with the same careful movements. "We need to talk about this properly." His hands never stopped moving as he reached for another shirt from the dresser drawer. "I know how this goes," he said to the garbage bag. "It's fine. He smoothed out wrinkles that weren't there and placed the shirt on top of the others. I watched him pick up his notebook from the nightstand and slide it between two hoodies. My chest felt tight, watching him pack away the few things he owned. I told him I needed to meet with Gilbert Kramer, our caseworker, to understand all the legal options first. His hands finally stopped moving. He looked up at me with those guarded eyes that had started to soften these past months. Something shifted in his face, like he hadn't expected me to fight for him at all. The next morning, Gilbert sat across from me at our kitchen table with his thick folder of paperwork spread between us. Steam rose from his coffee mug while he flipped through pages of regulations and rules. His finger traced down a list of restrictions while he explained in his flat government voice. The rules were ironclad, he said, tapping the paper for emphasis. If Jaden moved in, Theo had to leave within 48 hours. No exceptions, no workarounds, no special circumstances that could change it. The law was clear about registered offenders and minors in the same residence. I asked about temporary placements for Theo while we figured things out. Maybe another family could take him for just the 6 months until the restriction lifted. Gilbert shook his head slowly and pulled out another sheet showing placement statistics. At 17, with his history of 14 failed placements, any move would likely be permanent. Few families wanted older teens, and even fewer would take one with his record. The system would place him wherever they had space, probably a group home 2 counties over. After Gilbert left, I found Theo in the backyard with Rose helping her water the tomato plants that had died weeks ago. She held the empty watering can while humming some tune I didn't recognize. Theo sang along in that low voice he used just for her. She swayed slightly to their shared rhythm, completely calm, in a way she hadn't been in months. Her bare feet pressed into the grass, leaving small impressions. Theo guided her hand to tip the can over each dead plant, like they might still grow. That afternoon, I met Flora Pena at a coffee shop downtown, where the espresso machine hissed and customers typed on laptops. She wore a navy suit and carried a briefcase full of Jaden's case files. Her voice stayed professional while she explained the parole requirements. Jaden needed a verified address within 2 weeks, or he'd violate parole. The consequences were automatic and severe, meaning he'd go straight back to prison. She stirred sugar into her coffee while listing the documentation required for his release. Flora pulled out a printed list of halfway houses from her briefcase. The paper was worn at the edges from being handed to other desperate families. She explained the wait lists were long, but Jaden would need somewhere temporary first. Most places required background checks and deposits that took weeks to process. She circled 3 facilities with her pen, saying these might have openings sooner. I spent that evening at the kitchen table calling each number on Flora's list, while Theo made spaghetti at the stove. He moved between the counter and Rose's chair, helping her grip the fork properly. The first halfway house had a 3-month wait list and wanted references from previous landlords. The second place didn't answer after 6 rings. The third facility quoted a price higher than our mortgage payment. I crossed each one off the list, while Theo wiped sauce from Rose's chin with a napkin. She smiled at him and tried to say his name, but it came out wrong. He didn't correct her, just smiled back and gave her another bite. The phone rang after 9 that night, showing the prison number on caller ID. Jaden's voice cracked when I answered, sounding younger than his 21 years. "Dad, I'm so scared," he said through the static. Behind him, I could hear metal doors slamming and other inmates yelling. I did everything they asked in here. His breathing was ragged, like he'd been crying. I went to all the counseling sessions and stayed out of trouble. The background noise got louder with someone shouting about lights out. "I just want to come home, Dad." My chest tightened, remembering when he was little and would call for me after nightmares. "Please don't leave me here." The line went dead before I could answer. I sat there holding the silent phone for another minute before putting it down and heading to bed. The next morning came too fast, with Rose already dressed in her nightgown over her day clothes when I found her in the kitchen trying to eat cereal with a fork. Theo was gently switching it for a spoon while she hummed and swayed in her chair, not noticing the change. We got her into the car for her neurology appointment, and she kept grabbing at the door handle while we drove, so Theo held her hand the whole way there. The waiting room smelled like old coffee and cleaning products, while Rose tried to read magazines upside down. When the nurse called us back, Rose wouldn't move until Theo stood up first. Then she followed him like a shadow down the hallway. The doctor ran through his usual tests, having her draw a clock and remember 3 words while I watched her struggle with tasks she used to do without thinking. He increased her medication dosage and handed me pamphlets about adult day programs that might give us some structure during the week. Rose fell asleep in the car on the drive home with her head on Theo's shoulder while he stared out the window at passing buildings. He asked about those college acceptance letters I'd found in the trash, and I told him I knew what they meant. He said distance felt like abandonment once Rose started getting worse, and staying was the only choice that made sense. I wanted to tell him he deserved better, but the words stuck in my throat. That night, I woke to Rose screaming about intruders in the house and found her barricaded in the bathroom with towels shoved under the door. I stood frozen in the hallway, not knowing how to calm her down without making things worse. Theo walked past me, already humming that low, steady tune while kneeling by the door. Within minutes, she was opening it and letting him guide her back to bed, while I just watched, feeling useless. After she fell back asleep, I went to the kitchen and found myself crying over the sink, not able to stop. Theo came in and started making coffee without saying anything, then sat across from me at the table. We stayed there until sunrise, neither of us talking, but somehow that made it better. 2 days later, Gilbert showed up for a home visit with his clipboard and official paperwork. He watched Theo help Rose with her morning routine, noting how she responded to his voice and touch. Gilbert asked if we'd made a decision about Jaden, and I told him we were looking at halfway houses. His eyebrows went up, and he looked at Theo with something I hadn't seen before from a caseworker. He said, "Most families choose blood relatives over foster placements no matter what, and here we were doing the opposite." That afternoon, Flora called while I was sorting through overdue bills on the kitchen table. She said, Montgomery Field, who runs a halfway house across town, might have an opening soon. The facility had strict rules about curfews and drug testing, but could work for Jaden's situation if we moved fast. I thanked her and hung up, then looked at the pile of bills, realizing we were 2 months behind on the mortgage. The foster care stipend for Theo was the only thing keeping us from complete disaster right now. My work had been calling about missed shifts and shortened hours, but I couldn't leave Rose alone anymore. The next morning, my supervisor called me into his office with the door closed, which was never good. He said my absences were becoming a real problem, and I needed to find a solution or risk termination. I tried explaining about Rose's condition, but he just kept saying the company needed reliability. Walking back to my desk, I felt like the walls were closing in with no way out. Theo must have heard the conversation because he found me in the parking lot during his lunch break from the bookstore. He offered to defer college another year to help more with Rose, so I could work regular hours. I told him absolutely not, because he'd already given up those acceptances to MIT and Stanford. He just shrugged and said, "Family does what family needs to do," then walked back inside before I could argue. The weight of everything pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Rose needed more care than we could give her alone, and the money was running out fast. Jaden needed somewhere to live, or he'd violate parole and go back to prison for who knows how long. Theo kept sacrificing his future for us, when he should be planning for college and a normal life. My job was hanging by a thread, and without it, we'd lose the house within months. Every solution created 2 new problems, and I couldn't see a way through that didn't destroy someone I loved. That night, I watched Theo reading to Rose in the living room, while she played with the pages, not understanding the words anymore. He never showed frustration, just kept reading in that calm voice, while she smiled at nothing in particular. This kid who'd been rejected by 14 families was holding ours together with pure determination, and I didn't know how much longer any of us could keep going like this. The next morning, Iolanthe Webster met us at the Adult Day program entrance with a clipboard and too much energy for 7 a.m. She walked us through rooms filled with old people doing puzzles and singing songs from the 50s, while Rose gripped my arm tight enough to leave marks. The place smelled like bleach and cafeteria food and cost $800 a month for 3 days a week, which was still cheaper than full-time care, but more than our grocery budget. Rose kept trying to leave every time Iolanthe turned her back, and I had to block the door while Theo hummed his magic tune to calm her down. We signed up anyway because what choice did we have? And Iolanthe said Rose could start next week if the paperwork cleared. That afternoon, Flora called while I was trying to fix the leaking kitchen sink and said Jaden's release got moved up a week due to prison overcrowding. She said we had 72 hours to confirm housing, or he'd go to state placement, which was basically a homeless shelter with ankle monitors. My hands were shaking so bad, I dropped the wrench and it clanged against the pipes loud enough to wake Rose from her nap. I told Flora I'd call her back, then sat on the kitchen floor trying to breathe while water dripped onto my head from the broken seal. That evening I heard a crash from the bathroom and found Rose on the floor with blood running down her face from where she'd hit the sink. Theo was already there pressing a towel to her head while she fought him and screamed about strangers in her house. The EMTs arrived within 10 minutes and checked her pupils with their little flashlights while asking questions she couldn't answer. They said she needed stitches and observation, So we all piled into the ambulance again with Theo holding her hand and me filling out insurance forms on my phone. At the ER, they put 5 stitches above her eyebrow while she cried and asked for her mother who'd been dead 20 years. A social worker came by while we waited for discharge papers and suggested respite care to give us a break before we burned out completely. She handed me brochures for memory units that could take Rose for 2 weeks while we figured out long-term plans, and the prices made my chest tight, but not as tight as watching Theo's hands shake for the first time since he'd moved in. I called Montgomery from the hospital parking lot while Theo helped Rose into the car, and he confirmed they had a bed opening next week at the halfway house. The cost was $400 a month, plus Jaden would have to work part-time, which was required there anyway, and follow strict rules about curfews and drug tests. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than state placement, and Montgomery said they'd hold the spot for 48 hours if we committed. I called Jaden from the car while we drove home and told him about the halfway house option, trying to make it sound positive. He went quiet for a long moment, then exploded saying I was choosing a stranger over my real son and how could I do this to him after everything. His voice got louder and meaner until I couldn't take it anymore and hung up while he was mid-sentence about how Mom would be ashamed of me if she could understand what was happening. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and Rose was asking who was yelling while Theo stared out the window pretending not to notice. We got home, and I went straight to the back porch needing air and space from everything crushing down. Theo found me there 20 minutes later and sat on the steps without saying anything at first. Then he said he understood if I changed my mind about keeping him, because blood is blood, and nobody would blame me for choosing my real son. His voice was steady like always, but I could see the way his shoulders hunched like he was already packing that garbage bag in his head. The next morning, I drove to the memory care place where Baldrick Couch worked and signed papers for Rose's respite placement. 2 weeks in a secure unit starting Monday with activities and meals and trained staff who knew how to handle wandering and aggression. Baldrick showed me the room she'd have with its single bed and plastic furniture that couldn't hurt anyone, and I signed my name 12 times on forms about medication and emergency contacts. That afternoon, I found myself at a caregiver support group in a church basement, drinking terrible coffee from styrofoam cups. A woman named Carol told us about choosing her foster daughter over her bio son 5 years ago and how they haven't spoken since, even though she sends birthday cards every year. Another man talked about putting his wife in permanent care and visiting every day for 3 years until she stopped recognizing him completely. Everyone nodded and cried and shared their impossible choices, while I sat there thinking about Jaden alone in prison and Theo at home reading to Rose. Later that day, Theo had a video call with an online advisor about community college options, while I pretended to work on bills at the kitchen table. He asked about part-time programs where he could take morning classes while Rose was at daycare, then increase credits as things stabilized. The advisor talked about financial aid and transfer options, and Theo took notes in that same spiral notebook where he documented Rose's symptoms. He looked so young sitting there planning a future that revolved around caring for someone else's sick wife instead of going to MIT like he deserved. The day Jaden got released to the halfway house, Montgomery called while I was driving to work to confirm he'd arrived safely. Montgomery's voice was steady as he explained Jaden had refused to speak during the entire transfer, just stared out the window with his jaw clenched tight. But at least he was housed and following the intake rules. That first night without Rose at home felt wrong, like the house had too much air in it. But Theo pulled out an old DVD from the cabinet, and we ended up watching some action movie on the couch, both of us pretending not to notice how we kept checking the empty chair where Rose usually sat. 3 days later, I drove across town to the halfway house with a grocery bag full of Jaden's favorite chips and some clean shirts I'd found in storage. The building was gray concrete with small windows covered in mesh, and when Jaden came down to the common room, he wouldn't look at me, just grabbed the bag and mumbled something that might have been thanks before walking back upstairs. Gilbert showed up for Theo's official 18th birthday home visit the following week, sitting at our kitchen table with his clipboard and checking boxes while explaining the 6-month restriction would stay active no matter what. He watched Theo making lunch for Rose's return, noted how stable the placement was, wrote something about beneficial environment on his forms. Flora called that afternoon to go over the supervised visit rules, explaining Jaden could meet us at restaurants or parks, but couldn't come within 500 feet of the house for 6 months minimum. When Rose finally came home from respite care 2 days later, she was calmer, but kept looking around the living room asking where her boy was, getting more upset each time she couldn't find him. Theo would appear from his room, and she'd grab his hand, relaxing instantly, but 5 minutes later, she'd start searching again. The adult day program started that Monday with Rose going 3 days a week to the center downtown where Iolanthe ran activities. I'd drop her off at 8 in the morning and watch her shuffle inside with the other clients, then pick her up at 3 to find her tired but content, paint under her fingernails from art therapy. Iolanthe pulled me aside after the first week saying Rose was adjusting well, especially loving the music sessions where they played old songs from the 70s. Theo's actual birthday came on a Saturday. Just the three of us at the kitchen table with a small chocolate cake from the grocery store. Rose kept calling him Jaden while we sang happy birthday, and I watched Theo's face go tight for just a second before he smiled and helped her blow out the candles. 2 weeks later, I was washing dishes when I heard knocking at the front door and found Jaden standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets. My stomach dropped as I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, telling him he couldn't be here, that it would violate his parole and send him back to prison. He started arguing, saying it was his house too, but I was already pulling out my phone to document the incident for Flora, my hands shaking so bad I could barely type. After he finally left, stomping down the driveway and kicking the mailbox, Theo found me sitting on the porch steps with my head in my hands. He sat down next to me and said, "I always took the path that made everyone else comfortable, instead of doing what was actually right." I looked at him and admitted he was probably right, that I'd spent my whole life avoiding the hard choices, letting things happen to me instead of making decisions. He nodded and went back inside to check on Rose, who was calling for someone to help her find her shoes, even though she was already wearing them. The next morning, I signed Rose up for 5 days a week at the program instead of 3, figuring we needed the stability more than we needed the money we'd save. Montgomery called to say Jaden had gotten a warehouse job through their placement program, working 4 to midnight unloading trucks, which meant our paths wouldn't cross much even if we tried. I started visiting him every Sunday morning at a diner near the halfway house, bringing coffee and sitting across from him while he picked at eggs and complained about his roommate who snored. Gilbert came by again for a standard check-in, finding Theo helping Rose with a puzzle at the dining room table while I sorted through medical bills in the kitchen. He made notes about continued stability and asked if we'd thought about extended foster care through college, which would keep Theo eligible for support until he turned 21. Flora sent paperwork about establishing a visitation schedule with Jaden, suggesting we start with public meetings once a week and see how it went from there. The routine started to feel almost normal, dropping Rose at day program, working my full shift, picking her up, making dinner while Theo helped her eat, then all of us watching TV until she got tired around 8. Jaden kept his distance mostly, though Montgomery mentioned he'd driven by the house a few times according to his GPS monitor, always slowing down, but never stopping. Theo enrolled in 2 community college classes for the fall semester, Intro to Psychology and English Composition, scheduling them for mornings while Rose was at her program. We found a rhythm that actually worked, even if it wasn't what any of us had planned, even if it meant accepting that some things would never go back to how they were before. The bookstore manager called Theo the next morning about a part-time position shelving books and helping customers find titles. He started that Monday, working noon to 5 while Rose was at the day program with Iolanthe. I'd drop Rose off at 8:30, drive to work, and Theo would pick her up at 3 in his beat-up Honda he'd bought with his first paycheck. Every evening at 6:30, he'd sit next to her bed with whatever paperback he'd brought home from work. She'd fall asleep to his voice reading about detectives or space adventures or small-town romances, and most nights, she'd stay asleep until morning. I finally made it through a whole work week without leaving early or calling in sick. My supervisor stopped by my desk Friday afternoon and pulled the performance warning from my file, saying whatever I'd figured out was working. That same week, Montgomery called to say Jaden had started at the warehouse, working 4 to midnight unloading trucks. He was showing up on time, passing his drug tests, attending the required group sessions twice a week. The neurologist looked at Rose's chart during our next appointment and suggested we increase the day program to 5 days since she was responding well to the structure. I did the math on my phone while sitting in the waiting room and realized with Theo's bookstore income and my steady paychecks, we could actually afford it. Gilbert came by with the paperwork for extended foster care, which would keep Theo in the system through college with continued support. I signed every page while he explained how Theo could stay until he turned 21, as long as he was enrolled in the school. That night I called Jaden from the garage where Theo couldn't hear. I told him I loved him, but Theo was family now too, and would be staying permanently. He yelled for a while about how I was choosing a stranger over my real son, but he didn't hang up. When he finally stopped shouting, I suggested weekly visits at public places, supervised like Flora required. He said he'd think about it, and hung up without saying goodbye. Baldrick called 2 days later about a new program opening up, one with extended hours until 8 at night. This would mean both Theo and I could work normal schedules without rushing to pick up Rose. We toured the facility that weekend, watching the staff lead activities and serve dinner to the residents. Rose seemed calm there, humming along to the music they played during craft time. We moved her to the enhanced program the following Monday. That first night home, she ate dinner without throwing anything and went to bed without crying. Theo and I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing out a chore chart and budget that divided everything fairly. He'd handle groceries and laundry, I'd cover bills and yard work, we'd split cooking based on who got home first. Our first supervised visit with Jaden happened at a diner off the highway the next Sunday. Flora sat 2 booths away, pretending to read a newspaper while we picked at pancakes and tried to find safe topics. Jaden kept his hands folded on the table the whole time, asking about Rose's health and Theo's job without any real interest in the answers. When the hour was up, he stood and nodded at me before walking to Montgomery's van in the parking lot. It wasn't much, but he'd shown up and stayed the whole time without yelling or storming off. Theo filled out his community college application that night at the kitchen table, while I helped Rose with her dinner. He planned to take intro to psychology and English composition in the mornings, while Rose was at her program, then work at the bookstore in the afternoons. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that almost felt normal. Mornings started with getting Rose ready and dropping her at the program by 8. I'd work my full shift without interruption, actually catching up on projects I'd been behind on for months. Theo would get Rose at 5:30 after his bookstore shift, start dinner, help her eat while I drove home in rush hour traffic. We'd watch game shows together until Rose got tired, then Theo would read to her until she fell asleep. Jaden kept showing up for our Sunday visits, each one slightly less awkward than the last. He started talking about his warehouse job, complaining about his supervisor and the guy who always took too long on smoke breaks. Montgomery reported he was following all the halfway house rules, making curfew, keeping his room clean, attending required counseling. 3 months into the new routine, things actually felt stable. Rose knew the day program staff by their voices, even if she couldn't remember their names. Theo had regular customers at the bookstore who asked for his recommendations. I hadn't gotten a warning at work in weeks, and my supervisor mentioned a possible promotion. Even Jaden seemed to be finding his footing, talking about maybe getting his forklift certification to move up at the warehouse. The 6-month restriction would lift soon, but we all knew the current arrangement was working. Jaden had his independence at the halfway house, Theo had stability with us, and Rose had the care she needed. It wasn't the family any of us had imagined, but it was the one we'd built from the broken pieces of what came before. 3 months passed with everyone finding their own rhythm. Jaden called one Tuesday, asking if I wanted to see his new place through the transitional housing program. I drove across town to a brick building with fresh paint on the window frames and buzzers that actually worked. His apartment was on the 3rd floor, small but clean, with a couch from Goodwill and a coffee table he'd built from pallets at work. He showed me the kitchen where he'd organized his dishes in the cabinets and pointed out the view of the parking lot like it was something special. I noticed he'd hung a photo of us from when he was 12, before everything went wrong. We stood there looking at his space, and I told him I was proud of how he'd set it up. He nodded and offered me water in a glass he'd bought himself. Rose's medications finally hit the right balance after all those adjustments. She couldn't remember our names anymore, but she'd smile when we walked in the room and reach for our hands during meals. The day program had her on a schedule that kept her calm most days. She'd paint with watercolors in the morning and listen to old music in the afternoon. Sometimes she'd hum along to songs from the 60s and tap her fingers on the table. The staff said she was one of their easier residents now that we'd found what worked. At home, she'd sit between Theo and me on the couch, holding both our hands while we watched her favorite cooking shows. One evening I found Theo in his room pulling out those college acceptance letters from a folder. He smoothed out the MIT one and put it in a frame from the dollar store. When I asked about it, he said he'd reapply in 2 years when things were more settled and he had money saved. He hung it above his desk next to the community college schedule, where he'd circled his psychology and English classes. The bookstore had promoted him to assistant manager, which meant better hours and health insurance. He was saving half his paycheck in an account he showed me on his phone. Thursday mornings became our new routine with Jaden. We'd meet at the same diner off the highway at 7 before my shift started. He'd order black coffee and eggs over easy while I got pancakes. We talked about safe things like his warehouse job and the weather forecast. He told me about getting his forklift certification and the raise that came with it. I'd update him on Rose's condition and Theo's college classes without going into too much detail. We never mentioned the past or why things were this way. The waitress knew our order by the 3rd week and had the coffee ready when we walked in. Those breakfasts weren't much, but they were something we could both handle. The 6-month restriction date came and went without any of us mentioning it. Jaden had settled into his apartment and started making friends at work. Theo had his routine with school and the bookstore and helping with Rose. I'd gotten that promotion at work with the steady schedule I could finally maintain. We all knew changing things now would mess up what was working. Flora called to confirm the restriction had lifted, but said Jaden seemed stable where he was. Montgomery reported he was one of their success stories at the halfway house. Everyone agreed keeping the current arrangement made the most sense. The paperwork for Theo's extended foster care came through in October. Gilbert brought it to the house himself, explaining how Theo could stay through college with support for tuition and housing. We signed the papers at the kitchen table while Rose colored in her adult coloring book beside us. Theo would officially be part of our family until he graduated, with the option to extend if he went to grad school. Gilbert said it was one of the smoothest permanent placements he'd seen in 20 years. That night at dinner, Rose sat between Theo and me like always. She held both our hands while we ate the spaghetti Theo had made. Her grip was firm, even though her eyes were confused. She didn't know who we were, but she knew we were her people. She'd look back and forth between us and smile like she'd figured out something important. When Theo helped her with her pills, she patted his cheek and said thank you to the nice boy. After dinner, she fell asleep on the couch with her head on my shoulder and her hand in Theo's. We sat there watching some nature documentary about penguins, not wanting to wake her. These quiet moments felt more like family than anything I'd had before. Thanksgiving came faster than expected. Jaden suggested we meet at a restaurant instead of trying to figure out the house situation. We picked a place downtown that served turkey dinners all day. It was the first time we'd all been together in public since everything happened. Jaden showed up 5 minutes early in a button-down shirt I'd never seen. Theo wheeled Rose in wearing the purple sweater she loved. We sat at a round table where everyone could see each other. The conversation stayed surface level, but we all stayed the whole meal. Jaden even helped Theo get Rose to the car afterward. It wasn't perfect with all the history between us, but we were trying. That was more than I ever thought we'd manage after everything that happened. I really appreciate you sticking with me through all the questions and curiosity today. It means a lot to share these moments with you. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.